Welcome, world, to another episode of Nobody's a Nobody podcast with me, Mike McVeigh. This is the podcast where I interview people I find absolutely fascinating, and I believe you will too, if you give them a chance. This week's podcast will be featuring the Caregiver, Kathy Cox, and Hot Dog Song of the Week from Jarvix is going to feature Endocrine Twins' Clone Rainbow Chrome Halo. If you can say that 5 times fast without getting your tongue twisted, good for you. Now, our business of the week, our shout out business, is going to be my friend Allison and her business Paintings by Allison. That's AllisonSimmons.com, and it's spelled with one L, ALISONSIMMONS.com. And she does some wonderful paintings, primarily of classic vehicles. In fact, I got my father-in-law a couple years ago for Christmas. I got him one of her paintings and he absolutely loves it. He hangs it up, so I'm assuming he really likes it, but she does other things as well, but that's the thing that she's been really known to be a specialist. So check out Paintings by Allison. And we always want to make sure to remember Kaylee Vaughn and Our Neighborhood Empowered, 1okc.org. We are wanting to continue to create opportunities for children and teenagers to learn the basic skills necessary to have a true chance in life. Now, I want to keep on advertising this. I haven't really mentioned as much. I'm going to start promoting this a little bit more on the website and on my Facebook page. But the Epic 42 birthday party on February 20th, 2021 will be just a little bit less than a month away. And we're going to have bands like Dave Ross, well, that's not a band. We're going to have Dave Ross as a keynote speaker. We're going to have Bugnog, the band we featured back on Rob Trotter's episode. By the way, Rob Trotter is hosting this. We'll have Jarvix, Jacoby Ryan, Lucas Oswalt, Michael Frazanki, and we're going to have not one, but 2 Oklahoma City improv troops performing. One of them, Cheryl, will be performing live, and it's a one-time show, so if you miss it, that part will not be recorded. However, the other group, Talk About It, is going to have a post party. So as soon as the show is over, you can switch over to another channel. You can watch Talk About It. So it's going to be kind of a cool exclusive for those who are willing to do a little bit more. Now, that's going to be February 20th. It's going to be starting approximately 4:30 p.m. and it'll go to about 7 p.m. And then the after party from 7:30 till 8 or so. So please check that out. Stay informed. And if you have questions, please email me at mike.w.mcveigh@gmail.com. This week's episode is going to be featuring Kathy Cox, the Caregiver. She is someone I've met a couple years ago and we've become friends. She has done multiple things, and like so many others, we've cut down a lot of those things because there's just not enough time. However, she's traveled all over the world in a way that's a little bit different than most of our guests that have had the pleasure to travel. And, well, let's just talk to Kathy and talk about her current job. So what is geriatrics, and what does it mean to be a geriatric nurse?
Well, geriatrics is basically people that are older. A lot of people tend to refer to that as over 65 because 65 was, kind of the retirement age. But, people are living longer, working longer. I tend to refer to geriatrics as when people are starting to have more health problems. They are mostly older. They can be healthy, but some people start to have to manage more health problems. And what I do is I help these people age in place, which is live where they want to live. So that can be in their home, in their parents' home, maybe in an apartment, maybe at a facility. Age a place in their place of choice. So the agency that I work for, Care Plus Home Care, I am their only nurse. I go in and do all the home assessments to determine the appropriate level of care, whether we can take care of them, and what we can do. So we do short shifts, the long shifts, respite, total care.
So how long have you been doing geriatric nursery?
Well, in this particular job, I just celebrated 9 years with my anniversary with this company in January. I started right after the 1st of January. Right. So I've been doing this 9 years now. When I first started working as a nurse, I did intensive care unit. The reality is most people who go to the hospital are going to be older people. I do say that maybe mine is a community geriatrics. So nursing, gets divided into pediatrics, which is kids. Geriatrics is older people. You have hospital nursing, then you have community nursing. So you have a lot of different levels. So I would say that right now I'm in the community. So I'm helping people manage their health care or their ability to live alone or whatever they need to do in the community.
So, how long have you been a nurse overall?
I became a nurse when I was 21. So that's 45 years. No, 35 years.
And up until 9 years ago, you did intensive care, or
Right. When I first got out of college, I did surgical intensive care. Those were people that had high risk surgeries. The hardest thing that is about nursing is it's actually a very physical field. And I found working in a hospital very difficult physically. I transferred from that to dialysis nursing. Dialysis has two components. One is people who go to a dialysis center, that is, people whose kidneys don't work and they need dialysis, and they do that 3 times a week. But then when they come to the hospital, they need dialysis, whether they're in the hospital for something else, a heart attack. So I did dialysis nurse for a year, and then we relocated. That was when I was in Alabama. We relocated to Oklahoma. I became, this was like a general ICU intensive care unit that I worked. We did everything from open heart to surgical to medical. It's just a general field. At that time, when I was 27, I developed fibromyalgia. And again, it just became too physical. Then I went and worked in the nursery. Then I had my own kids, and my husband joined the Air Force. It just was not going to work because he was a meteorologist, and meteorologist is a 24/7 career field. Nursing is a 24/7 career field.
so you said your husband joined the Air Force after you were 27.
Right.
That's not common, right? Most people don't join the Air Force or military in their late 20s, early 30s.
Correct. My husband was a little bit of a late bloomer. When I met him, he was kind of figuring out what he wanted to do. So when he decided to become a meteorologist, we had just gotten married, and it took 4 years, 5 years to get his undergrad. And then so he was commissioned as an officer at age 29. So yeah, he was a little bit later, 28, 29. I don't remember, somewhere around that time frame. So when the kids were born, it was just, we weren't near family. It was really impossible to find any kind of childcare. And with the fibromyalgia, I couldn't really be a mom and a wife and a nurse. So I took 10 years off, and then I went back. I did in Albuquerque, I did 2 years of school nursing. Then when I came here, I did some flu clinics trying to find a job that would work with my health. And then I found this job. So I've kind of been all over the board and had some breaks.
So, is your husband still with the Air Force?
My husband retired, I want to say 7 years ago, did
Okay.
his 20 years. This was
And,
our last assignment. And then he retired.
and you already mentioned Albuquerque in Oklahoma. Where else did you guys live while he was in the Air Force?
When he got appointed or commissioned, I was pregnant and very sick, and we were already in Oklahoma, so they let us stay here for who was at Tinker for 3 years. Then they sent him to Colorado for 2 years to get his master's degree. We went to Guam, which is an island in the Pacific. We were there for 3 years. We went to Texas to get his PhD. Then we went to Florida to work at Cape Canaveral. So that was very fun and interesting. Then Albuquerque. And then he called up. We knew it was his last assignment. He says, I want to go back to Oklahoma. He liked it here, and he thought, he could probably get a job here. And so we bought our first house, and I've never lived in the same house for 11 years.
So, where in Texas did you guys live?
We were at Texas A&M in College Station.
Okay. Now, even before your husband joined the military, even though we talked about your nursing career, you're not a stranger to traveling around the world, or at least comparatively speaking. Most of us, we don't go very far out of where we grow up. It's within a few hours, maybe at most, other than vacations. You didn't grow up here in the United States, did you?
No, my parents, first, I had twin brothers, and then my father and mother felt called to the mission field. They got pregnant with me, and they were appointed in December of 1963, but they were going to go to Vietnam, South Vietnam, in the middle of the war. They decided that it was best to have me in a somewhat modern hospital here in the States. And then they got on a ship and went there when I was about 2 months old, and ended up in Vietnam, growing up bilingual with all the other Vietnamese kids. They spoke, I spoke Vietnamese with them, and then I spoke English at home.
All right. So your parents moved to Vietnam right after you were born, and
That's correct.
so basically you grew up in Vietnam for the next 15
11
or
years.
11 years. Tell us what it's like about being in South Vietnam, especially during such a highly contested time period in history.
Right. So we were there in 64. I don't know how much of the war was there. They went to one place to do some language school. They went to about 2 years, went to another place. So I don't remember those places that they went and worked with another missionary. We do come back to the States every 4 years for what they call furlough to kind of take a break. And then we go speak at all these churches and they show off the little missionary kids who are supposed to look so holy and angelic. And so when I was 5, they were assigned to their own town. It was a city called Quy Nhon. So it's, kind of exotic in some ways when you look back. I had Vietnamese celebrations and I had American celebrations. So mom tried to keep things somewhat American. So we celebrated Christmas and birthdays. And then they celebrated things like Chinese New Year, which they called Tet. We would go to everybody's house and eat sticky rice cakes and candied fruit. And nobody gave gifts. They gave these little red envelopes with money in them. Well, my parents didn't do that. So I went to everyone else's house, and most people were Buddhists. So they had these big shrines on their mantles, and we would have to be very quiet while the ancestors first ate the food, which I don't know really how they did that. It was kind of interesting. And then we would go to the square and we would see these like dragon dances. So, and I just homeschooled and I was done in like 2 hours and I just went outside and we just played. No, they didn't have any toys. So we did hopscotch in the sand and we did marbles and we drew our board games. We drew in the sand and we played everything in the sand. And we were the only people that had a car. Most everybody had either a bicycle or they rode public transportation. So the other interesting thing that we did quite often to get kind of away was we would go to this pristine, white, beautiful beach that was about 40 minutes outside of town. But to get to the beach, we drove through a leper colony. And so here I am, 6 years old, 7 years old, looking out my window at people whose nose were eaten away or their ears were eaten away. And, it's a little bit scary to me. And they just come out and look at this strange little white family. And then we would drive on through and just go to the beach, and nobody was ever at the beach.
So I'm going to stop you a little bit on the leprosy. I think most of us that are probably listening to this, the kind of leprosy that we would be thinking of would be coming from a biblical kind of perspective of leprosy, but that's not necessarily the same thing you're talking about. Is that correct?
No, it is actually the
Okay.
same leprosy caused by it's caused by a bacteria. And actually, I didn't know it at the time. So I researched it later on in life when the internet was invented. Is that actually leprosy is not as contagious as we thought it was. It was definitely contagious, with people who lived there. And so they would separate people and build these colonies. If you research this particular colony, it was actually one of the more humane leper colonies. These people had plots, very nice homes for that area of town. They actually had a cure for leprosy with some antibiotics, but the problem was this had already become people's homes and the damage that was done could not be reversed. So my understanding is that they were not at that point contagious, but that was already their home. So that's where they stayed. And then as those people died out, which was after we already left Vietnam, then they didn't bring people into that colony. And then it's now, from what I read on the internet, it's now a museum. So that was always kind of interesting about Vietnam for me. Unfortunately, there was the other side of me that wished I could have enjoyed more of the exotic part because I must have been suffering from undiagnosed depression. And I was, so I remember a lot of things about Vietnam with like this dark cloud. And I was very young, and I can remember thinking that it would be better if I wasn't alive, but I didn't know how to kill myself, I guess, if you want to say it that way. I can remember like sitting by the door with a knife to my throat because I thought I had twin brothers. I'm sure they would just run through the door and then I would, stab myself and stuff like that. So it kind of, I don't know. It's like there's this exotic side and there's this dark side. And I don't know why I had that, but I did. And it just was a part of my life. So I sort of have this dichotomy and of I was glad I was there, but I wish I didn't have the depression with it, because it seems to have blocked out a lot of my memories of what was probably could have been happy and fun things that I did.
So do you,
The,
sorry, do you still suffer with depression now?
Not as much with depression, but it did plague me through quite a bit of my life. And it would come up more as life went on with me. I also didn't realize at the time that I probably also had what's called social anxiety. So, believe it or not, I'm really a people person. I really like to be around people. But social anxiety is this fear that when I talk to people, it's not, it's more than a fear, it's like a terror. And some people understand it like in public speaking, but for me, it was one on one, like meeting people. This is terror that they would just think I was so stupid and awful that I just couldn't get over that. And so it was just hard to meet people, and I'm moving around between cultures, and I don't adapt well. So it just sort of made everything feel miserable, I guess, for me. Now, the interesting thing is how we left Vietnam, which I have a little bit of this story I heard from my parents. They went to see Mr. A in 1975, and this is when they heard that there was a lot of fighting getting closer to our province. And Mr. A looked at my parents, and Mr. A was obviously CIA. He said, "Oh, I get to meet the man and the woman who are number one and number two on the execution list if captured by the Communist North." He said, "It is getting too dangerous, and you guys need to leave this province."
How was that obvious to anybody that Mr. A worked with the CIA?
No, not obvious to me, but obvious to my parents that he
Okay,
knew so
because
much
you're like,
information.
yeah, obviously it was the CIA. I'm like, whoa, whoa, this just came out of
Only
nowhere.
because he knew that information that they were on the execution list.
So did that surprise your parents to know this, or did they already kind of know and this just
I,
confirm? So your parents get contacted by this guy from the CIA saying that they're on the top two of the two to be excommunicated or
ex,
executed.
executed in
Okay,
that
sorry,
province. In that
executed in that
province.
province. Now, was this a surprise for your parents, or did they already kind of know this?
I think they were a little bit surprised, honestly, from what I read. My dad wrote his memoirs, and I read that just recently again. And I was like, I think they were a little bit surprised. And they realized that they really didn't have the option to stay. At this time, I did have two older brothers. They were in the States because of schooling issues. They needed to have 1 year in the States. So it was me and my little brother. And he said that my parents had a couple of days, and that was the weekend. They took that last Sunday to go see all the churches that my dad had started and say goodbye to all the Christians and baptize everyone that had not been baptized. And then Mr. A brought a van to our house, and I carried my brother. My mom and dad, we each had one little suitcase, and he drove the van to the airport where there was a small plane, and we got into the plane. And our street was pretty much lined with our neighbors. The missionaries are the last to leave. So they knew that it didn't look good for them as far as the communist North coming down. And so they flew us to another city where there was a military base, where there was large gatherings of other Westerners, and we were loaded into military transport planes. We were then taken to the capital, and we were all sort of just camped out on, every missionary that lived in that capital city just had mattresses out. We were all camped out. And at that point, we were able to get commercial flights. They were bringing in lots and lots of commercial flights. So if you ever listen to the news and they're like sending in commercial flights to get Americans out of certain countries, that was kind of our experience. And for me, it was very emotional. I I was just, it was so sudden. I was leaving. I saw my friends' faces so scared. And we had been times that we had kind of left the country where we thought maybe it was time to just take a little vacation. But this one felt so permanent. I knew I wasn't going back. And I didn't want to leave. My parents didn't want to leave. It was the only life I really knew before I at least had some warning that I was leaving. And this one I didn't. So we went to Singapore to kind of wait, and the country did fall pretty quickly. The interesting thing is it seems like there's pillars in my life that are very strong emotions. And I guess that's one of them. And I didn't realize it because when I was in college, it was something I never really talked about. I didn't really know how to process that experience. And I'm in college, and everybody's like, we're going to all get together and watch the very last episode of MASH. I didn't know what MASH was, but it sounded like a big party. So I showed up. We're watching the last episode of MASH, and all it is an evacuation. Helicopters whirling, planes taking people. And I didn't last very long, and I'm in my bed curled up crying.
Yeah,
And
that
the
has
same
to.
thing happened when I watched the evacuation of Katrina. And it was just like, I don't ever know how to process that experience in my life. It just happened. And then sometimes something will trigger me and I will just be in my bed crying.
Yeah, that has to be kind of traumatic. And just historically ranking the last episode of MASH, I know you're not a pop culture nerd. I am. But the last episode of MASH was watched more than anything else in the United States that night. And in history, for a non-breaking newscast, it holds the all-time record up to that point. So that has to be extreme. So everybody was talking about it probably for a couple weeks after that at school or work or wherever. So I couldn't even imagine having to deal with that same thing. And you said so Katrina had a similar triggering effect.
It did. And so I do not watch any Vietnam. I tried to watch Good Morning Vietnam, the very bad mistake for me. So there's just certain things I so other than that, I don't watch any Vietnam shows. My brother's like, you should watch this. And I'm like, I don't know why, but it just triggers strong emotions. And I don't know. I'm just like, I don't know what to do about it. It's just there. So I just go on, and it happened. And I do understand. I mean, I was lucky. I'm an American. The CIA brought in a plane to get our family safe. I can't imagine the refugees who got on little fishing boats and the trauma that women were put through, by pirates, by refugee camps, and what happened to me. And I also get really confused when people are in America and they want to be communists. I'm like, I always saw people running away from it. I never saw anybody running to it. But I just, yeah, I think just also knowing the Vietnamese people too. I don't think it was just about me and the trauma of me leaving. Was what we knew people were leaving behind so much fear, and we couldn't do anything for them. It wasn't going to do any good for us to get killed. That wasn't going to help them. So we just had to leave and trust God for their lives and their growth, and what was going to happen to them.
Yeah, that's. And you came over as I want to say a junior in high school is what you came over when you came back to the United States. Is that correct?
Actually, we had only been 1 year back. Remember I was telling you about those 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
We'd only been 1 year back from a furlough. Mom and dad decided at that point, they prayed about it, and they wanted to move to Manila, Philippines, and take up new work. I went there in middle school.
Okay.
The other reason they wanted to go there was a missionary kids school. There was a Christian school for missionary kids. The teachers were all missionaries, and they felt a calling to give an education to missionary kids so that missionaries can go and do their work. And they just felt like it would be a little more stable for us at that time, for our family, that we kind of sort of needed something not traumatic again. It was still a culture shock because this was still westernized schooling for me. And I was hanging around people who are a little more familiar with culture, and I wasn't. I had no idea who, like, the Beatles were, or Michael Jackson, or any of those things. And so I'm adjusting. I think some of my depression wasn't as bad because these teachers were very nurturing people, and so it was a very nurturing environment for
And
me.
this is around 1983, or am I
No,
off? Okay, tell me.
75,
75.
75 to
75. Okay.
78.
Okay. Sorry. Part of the MASH thing threw me off. So since that was in the 80s, that's okay.
Yeah, that was college.
All right. So 75, 78 was when you were in the Philippines?
That
Or,
was my middle school year. So then that fourth year hit my ninth grade year.
okay.
So I came to the States only for 1 year in high school in ninth grade.
Yeah, so it's actually understandable you didn't know who Michael Jackson was. He was still only one of the Jackson Five at that point.
Right.
um,
I oh no, it wasn't Michael Jackson. Who's the other guy that died? Elvis Presley.
that'd be a little bit bigger, yeah.
Yes, I
Uh,
was like, they all came to school. Elvis Presley died. I have no idea who you're talking about.
well, it happens. I mean,
And it
so
didn't help that my parents were really music people, so I didn't listen to much music anyway.
now, just out of curiosity, if you're willing to share, what denomination were your parents missionaries for?
So my parents were appointed by the Southern Baptist Mission Board.
Okay, and so now that you're in junior high, going over to from one culture to another, do you feel like you embodied the missionary spirit more or less? Because I know, like as a kid, I mean, you just grew up with it. You didn't really have much of a choice. But now that you were out of one country, did it feel like your parents obviously felt the call and they were living that part? But being a teenager, especially during those formative teenage years, do you feel like you embraced the call that they had, or do you feel like you had like kind of a quiet rebellion that you were there, but you weren't really happy with it?
No, I really had no problem with being in another culture, living in another country. I just wish I hadn't been depressed, you know, and that kind of thing. I mean, I wish I could have enjoyed it more in that sense. And the experiences are just phenomenal, and what I bring to life. And I meet people from different countries, and I can just, I start asking them. I'm just so curious. It's like, tell me about your food and your cultures and your celebrations. And I love all that. I love that richness that I had. I wish I hadn't been depressed in the same time, but that had nothing to do. I could have been in the States and been depressed. I mean, it that could have happened to anyone. That mental health problem. And back then, it doesn't matter where I lived. People didn't recognize really depression, even in children, but much less. It just wasn't a big, topic. It wasn't something that people were treating, that kind of stuff. And I was really confused because I thought only depressed people came from like broken alcoholic families, and I'm coming from a missionary family. So there was just a lot of that. I don't understand that type of stuff that I didn't understand, but I never really minded that I got to live overseas.
When so, how did your parents react to your depression, or did they even know you were depressed? Or
They did not know. The only time, and they didn't tell me at the time, was in ninth grade when I was in the States. Was, of course, I went from 500 missionary kids school, which was a shock from Vietnam, but now I'm in like a 3,000 public high school, and I know nothing about, drugs and anything else that people have in high school here in the United States. I was very, very depressed. And my high school teacher, my English teacher at the time, said, you got to keep a journal. So I'm writing in this journal. And so I just started writing all my emotions. I didn't know at the time they did find my journal, and they were reading it every night because I was very suicidal at that time. And they were like, is she going to live to be the next day? But they didn't know what to do. So,
this is while you were in the Philippines.
no, it was that one year I was in the States in ninth
Okay,
grade.
okay, okay,
Between middle school and high school is that 1 year of furlough.
okay.
And that was the year that I know I've shared with you of the time that I was on the hayride, and I reached my lowest point because nobody would talk to me. And I had decided that night that I was just going to go home and take all the pills I could find of my parents once they went to sleep. And then two people came up and started talking to me and just made me feel really welcomed. They listened to my missionary stories. I mean, that's what I wanted to do, is like share this exciting life I had. And it's like that depression lifted just enough that I knew I was in trouble, and I had to find a way to fight it. And I didn't know how. I didn't know anything, but I knew I couldn't think about suicide anymore. That was like the one thing I knew. I had to battle that thought, and I wasn't ever going to let that thought take me down that road again. So I still struggled with depression, but I just said, I'm going to figure out a way to live life. I think definitely by the time I about 16, I think I began, I always had a close relationship with the Lord. I just always remember knowing God. And I would sit in my swing. I would sit in my swing, and it was like there was a little light, and that was God. And I just kept finding more light. And I don't really know how to explain it. And it was like sometimes I would get a glimpse, like now I would know, like I've been through counseling. So I was like, I knew a little more what to do, the battle of the mind, and, kind of retraining how I thought, and accepting too that it didn't make me a bad Christian because I was struggling with depression. I think the guilt on top of it made it worse, rather than just going, it's not my fault. It it's not doesn't mean that I have an excuse to not deal with and manage it, but it's not my fault that I have mental health problems and that I have to manage it. And I guess that was life, was accepting it and figuring out how to live life, and how to realize that mental illness is a battle many times of the mind, but it's not a simple formula. You just do A, B, C, and D and you won't be depressed. That's not really the answer. I mean, for me, it's been my faith, my friendships, counseling, medication. It's just, I just have all of it. I think that a lot of me was the battle of the mind. And so depression is something that I don't struggle as much with. And I went more into anxiety as I got older on that side of it. But I definitely, so in high school, my mom and dad are like, what do you want to be? And I was like, I want to be a counselor because I really wanted to help people. I knew what it was like to suffer deeply. And they were like, you can't make any money being a counselor. They were so against it. I just didn't want to go against their wishes. So, I told the story. My brother's like, the nursing dorms are really nice. And I was like, okay, I'll be a nurse because I can still help people and go to these nice nursing dorms. It wasn't probably always the best decision. There's been times that nursing is hard, but in the long run, I think God used it and it was the right decision for me. But I definitely wanted to go into a profession where I could help people. I wanted to be able to spend my time helping people and make a living at the same time. And that was really before nursing. This was in the early 80s. It wasn't like everybody was trying to become a nurse to get job security. I became a nurse because I really wanted to help people. But back then, believe it or not, when I graduated, there was a little bit of a surplus of nurses. So it wasn't like you just could waltz in and pick whatever job you wanted.
So, so how long ago would you say approximately that you shifted from dealing with depression to dealing with anxiety primarily?
I think that I didn't recognize the anxiety as much as the depression because the depression was just dark and strong. But I didn't know what social anxiety was until a family member of mine was diagnosed about 5 or 6 years ago. And I was like, oh, that's what I've struggled with my whole life. That butterfly, just terror feeling of talking to people, calling people on the phone, and that kind of stuff. And so, because I don't struggle with depression, maybe I just see the anxiety more, but I think they were always both together, if that makes sense. But I did have one more spell, well, a couple more spells, but like when I turned 40, there was a lot going on. And I'm not a person that cries a lot. I don't really have lots of emotion. And I just woke up. I don't know why. I was just crying all morning. And this was a depression that was different in that it was physical, in that it felt like I was just trying to walk through molasses. That's how they used to describe it in nursing school. So it was kind of weird. I was like analyzing myself because I'm scientific. I'm like, this is just like nursing school. It's like trying to go through molasses. I was like, I couldn't think straight. And that was kind of a different time in my life, in that I always felt very confident because I was smart. I didn't even know I was smart, until I got out of homeschooling and got into a regular school. And I was like, I was making the honor roll. And so I always felt very confident in my mental abilities as far as being smart and competent and strong and getting stuff done. But I was very insecure in my social skills. So when I turned 40 and I had this major depression again, I couldn't do anything. Like, I couldn't teach children's church. I couldn't cook a meal. I mean, I felt like I was looking at my life with just broken glass all over the floor. And there was nothing that I could do about it. It was just everything was broken and I didn't know what to do. It was just such a strange time because it was a time I felt really close to God. And there all of a sudden was this clarity in my life, in that, I was so insecure and I just built up these big walls and I never let anybody in to any of the hurt. It's just like I'm I'm confident. Everybody was like, I want to be more like you because I mean, I looked organized and together and all that. No one saw any more of my weaknesses. I don't know if it's just all that depression or just always changing cultures and just feeling left out. I just said, I don't know that I did it intentionally. I think I just did it as a protective mechanism. And I just realized I couldn't live like that anymore.
So, Kathy, what is, if someone wants to reach out to you and has questions or might want to look at your services, what's the best way for them to contact you?
You can go to my website at Kathy's Consulting, KATHYSCONSULTING.com. My contact information will be there. My website has also my podcast on there. I don't have any blogs at this point, but maybe I'll add those. It also has got my email and a way to contact me so you can see, some services that I do offer on the side if that is something that you're interested in stuff. And then I just began to be more real and honest with people and just more open and be like, this is who I am and take it or leave it.
Right. Now, you happen to have a reputation of raising bunnies instead of having cats or dogs. And whether we want to make a fake segue and say, well, one way to help with depression or anxiety is bunnies, but how did you get into bunny rabbits and all of their evilness instead of the evilness of cats or dogs?
I married a guy who was allergic to cats and dogs. And I didn't really want any animals because it was hard enough keeping my house clean without animals. But my son was getting older, liked stuffed animals, which there's nothing wrong with that. But it was beginning to be a problem at school. So, we didn't want to encourage anything that was going to encourage bullying. So we thought, let's try a rabbit. So we went to see a rabbit, and my husband stuck the rabbit all in his nose. And then we went to lunch. He came back and stuck the rabbit in his nose, kept doing that. He says, I think we can do a rabbit. And so he didn't seem to be as allergic to rabbits. So we got a rabbit, and the kids were just so excited to have a pet. You know how they are about anything, they hadn't had any pets for years. And so we just got rabbits, and the first rabbit was just horrible. And then we found an abandoned rabbit, and that first rabbit, Thumper, tried to kill the abandoned rabbit, was just the meanest thing. We had to get rid of him because the abandoned rabbit was just sweet. And after that, we sort of learned about rabbit personalities and how to look for the right rabbit. And then we got better. We never gave another rabbit back because we figured out, how to train them so they don't kill each other. They can be territorial. Actually, they're kind of funny, but it's interesting. My son has a dog that stayed with us for a short spell. So we are looking for a dog right now, but yeah, we've had 5 rabbits. We still have 3 that are alive. They're 7, 8, and 9. They live about 10 years. So as they go off to rabbit heaven, we're going to probably look for a dog. Because my husband, for some reason, is doing a little better with dogs right now.
Okay, I was curious about that. Now, you're mentioning about training your rabbits not to kill each other. Do you also train them to kill other people and kind of have
yes,
like
we have to have. I do know that pop culture reference in the Monty Python, and I hate Monty Python. I only like the rabbit part. And my husband and I will always look at anybody comes to our house. Be careful! They got big teeth. They got big teeth. They're going to bite your neck. So we have to warn everybody about our killer rabbits.
Does your husband like Monty Python?
He loves Monty Python.
I was gonna say,
yeah, he's watched it so many times.
Like it. One of the two of you has to like it.
Yeah, I like a few sections of it, but it just gets so absurd after a while. I'm like, okay. So there's a few parts that make me laugh, and then the rest, I'm just like, it's just too much. Rabbits, they have a lot of personality. They're all different, believe it or not. So there's a lot about rabbits once you learn about them. They're very social creatures. They just don't like to be picked up because when you pick up a rabbit, they think you're trying to eat it. So if you sit on the ground, they'll jump all around you and they'll let you pet them and stuff like that. And so you just have to do that. The biggest problem is at 56, it's getting harder and harder to get up and down from the ground. And that's kind of why I told my husband, this is the last of the rabbits. I need a dog that can jump on the couch.
You started Knowledge for Caregivers, and talk about what was the impetus for starting that podcast.
When I first started my job, I was like, I didn't know what I was doing. I was the only nurse. So I'm like jumping in, trying to learn things, getting out in the community, trying to figure out community resources. And as I got along, and I would go visit with clients. A lot of times their adult children were involved in decisions. They were trying to protect their parents because scammers do go after older people. So it was always interesting. I'd walk into a room and I thought, oh, I'm coming here to meet one or two people to see if they want to sign up for our services. And then it's like, surprise, there's three more children and it's a family meeting. I never minded. And I always told them, I said, I want you to ask me questions because I want you to doubt everything, question everything, because I don't want you taken advantage of. I tried to start a blog at my work website. I just couldn't keep up with it. And when you become a nurse, I used to write great until I became a nurse, because in nursing, we write like short, choppy, patient, SOB, which is short of breath, not the other thing. My writing became choppy and short because you write notes very concisely. So it was very hard. And so I thought, when the summer came last year, I knew nothing about podcasts. My daughter got me onto podcasts and I was listening and I was like, I can do a podcast. Now I had to take a class to learn the technology, but I have 9 years of knowledge in my brain and I just cannot give it all at one time to these people, to these clients of mine, and to their loved ones. Most of the time it's adult children, but I mean, sometimes it's a niece, nephew, aunt, uncle. And I don't know if I even picked the best name, but I worked on it so long. I thought, you know what? I'm just going to go with it. And if I want to change it down the road, I'll just have to repay my guy that I did my logo for me and name it something else. But I am kind of like, I wanted to give knowledge, and I love to teach. And so I thought, well, that's really what I'm doing is I'm teaching. I'm trying to give this knowledge to people. And I guess it's a little deceptive when I say knowledge for caregivers, because I thought, really people need to listen to it kind of when their parents turn about 65, 70 and start learning this material first rather than waiting until the crisis happens, or like, I wish I had known that before.
Right.
But I'm dealing, my mother dealt with congestive heart failure for many, many years. She turned to me for so much. Now she passed away 6 years ago. I got her on hospice because I understood hospice. Now my husband's parents, I'm the kind of point of contact. They're in Virginia, so I'm doing this long distance. So I'm kind of in the boat with everyone else, but I know the resources.
Right. Right. And that's one
I
of the reasons why I find this podcast actually really helpful, because my in-laws and my parents are all within that range, that 65 to 70 range. And even though they seem to be in pretty good health right now, I won't lie. It's these, even the small things. I mean, one of the episodes you talk about the shower stool or shower chair to use, and once you explain it, it made complete sense to me. Like, yeah, absolutely, that does make a difference. That makes sense why you would use this or not use that. But I would have never given 2 seconds worth of attention to it had you not brought it up in the episode. And that's one of the reasons why, and that's not just the only episode. I mean, it was September, but yeah, every single thing you've talked about, even though I don't think most of those, or hopefully most of those, won't apply to my in-laws or my family, it's really good to know, because it's something I can point to. Oh, you talk about Benzies? Yeah, you need to check out that episode on Knowledge for Caregivers with Kathy.
Yeah, I'm really kind of hoping to have a library, and then somebody can just go, well, let's see, they're on, I don't have that yet, but oh, they're on blood thinners. I want to learn about blood thinners. Or, oh, I just did the one on driving. I just was trying to take all the knowledge I have and just try to put them in an episode that makes sense. 10 minutes seemed about right for me. I like that. Not doing an interview right now. I can keep it short, and I also don't have to be as technologically savvy. So I may eventually do some interviews. The pandemic definitely, messed with that, because I know so many people like downsizing, hoarding, in the community that probably have more knowledge than I do. And I'm not sure if I'm going to interview them and do like an interview podcast and add it to it, or if I'll just gain all their knowledge and give them credit and,
Right.
say, I learned this from this person, like how to pick a facility. I know people in Oklahoma City. I just know basically A to Z of all the resources that are available. And so many times just little things like, what's the difference between what we do, which is private duty, and home health care, which I haven't even gotten into.
Right.
Like just today, a lady called and said, I'm sorry, I didn't have my brother there for your caregiver to show up, because the nurse called and said they canceled services. And so then I had to figure out how many agencies during doing different services did she have in her home, so I could figure out who had canceled a service and explain to her who canceled the service and what
Right.
we were, and that we were a different agency and that we were still active in her home. So it's just one of those things that I just wanted to, I guess for me, I've always wanted to help people. I don't know why, that's just something I was born with. And so it was just another avenue to say, hey, here's a way to go check out this resource. And if it helps you, then I'm just glad that it helps you out. And I was so excited. Somebody actually wrote me through LinkedIn and was like, hey, I've been enjoying your podcast, and they live in Canada. And I'm like, I don't even know about Canadian healthcare.
Yeah.
But he said it's about the same as here. If you have money, you get better care.
Well, I want to recommend specifically while people are listening to listen to episode 11, which is Are You a Caregiver? And that episode kind of sets a foundation because that was something we've had several talks about, whether or not someone is a caregiver or not. And when I think of caregiver, I think of something different. But you go through in that episode in particular of explaining caregiver is not so much job title like nurse kind of thing, but it's basically someone that you might have to be responsible for even if they're not in your own home. So even if your parents are living in a home or they're living with you or whatever, being the one that's the primary decision maker in a sense is the same thing as being a caregiver. And you go in much better detail in that 12-minute episode than I just did in that 30 seconds or so. But Knowledge for Caregivers with Kathy Cox, you can find it on pretty much every podcast player. I listen through Castbox. That's my favorite one to listen through, but it is on Apple Podcasts, and I think it's on all the other major podcasts as well.
Hot dog. Hot dog. Hot dog. Hot dog. Hot dog.
Hey listeners, it's Jarvix again with my hot dog song of the week. I've gone on record multiple times saying that my Make Oklahoma Weirder music blog is not strictly about the weird and obscure, but more about discovering the variety of music that lives in my backyard. What's weird to some is not always weird to another, and it's the crossing of paths and different tastes and walks of music that I find so enlivening. That said, however, I do have a soft spot for the weird and obscure. I began the first installment of this segment with just such a song back in 2020 with the Fulton Ansley Project. I say all of this because I'm bringing you an experimental band this episode that goes by the name Endocrine Twins. Indeed, this is a two-piece project, but it's one that uses a plethora of odd sounds, combining computers, guitars, keyboards, and tons of vocal effects to make full-bodied music that blurs the line between performance and production. Endocrine Twins, to me, is a celebration of the adventurous nature of weirdness. They haven't dropped a proper album yet, and I think it's because they've just been too busy hopping from one idea to the next, in single after single throughout the past couple of years. The diversity in their recordings is arguably more prevalent in the song structures than the sounds themselves, which is quite a feat given how much of a spectrum this still relatively new band has presented thus far. I think it's also worth noting that this is an art rock project, too. The band members make a point of not showing their faces, and while it could just be general shyness, I think of it as presenting an abstracted interface. The twins to me are like vessels of music, letting the artistic whims of the muse direct their public image, as if they are not the painters, but the canvas. What I love about Endocrine Twins is that they really do embody weirdness in all its flourishes. As someone who runs a brand that's all about weirdness, I see my fair share of folks that claim to be all about it, but few who actually walk the talk. I do believe that weirdness exists in all of us, but not all of us are fearless enough to let it out for the world to see. I know because even I hold back a lot of my strange whims to properly navigate this standardized world of ours, even in my music. To me, Endocrine Twins are inspiring in their fearlessness. The song I'm sharing is the latest single called Clone Rainbow Chrome Halo. In addition to being, yes, weird, it's also quite pretty. I love everything about this, but especially the chorus, where the rambunctious percussion and the distantly haunting low voices swirl together into moments of melodic clarity. If you'd like to see the band in action, there's a music video for this on the official Endocrine Twins YouTube page that I like quite a bit. You can also check out a collection of the band's other 2020 singles and a 5-track release on Bandcamp at endocrinetwins.bandcamp.com. Here is Clone Rainbow Chrome Halo by Endocrine Twins.
thank you, Endocrine Twins. That is definitely weird music, but I love it. I'm looking forward to listening to some more on Bandcamp. Check out Kathy Cox's podcast and check out some paintings from Allison, AllisonSimmons.com. Always want to support one, and I want to thank you so much for listening. This is always a pleasure. We're almost through January, one more episode, and then we'll be into February. So, whew, long year already. Nobody's a nobody, and that means you. Until next time.